Hello, my name is Luigi Mont, a 3D artist and instructor at CG Boost, and I'm excited to welcome you to this Blender robot creation course for beginners. In this robot creation course, we will cover the full production of this little guy, Frogbot. Modeling from a concept sketch, adding materials, a simple environment, rigging, animating, rendering, and adding a little bit of post-process polish before exporting it out to the world to admire. All you need is a copy of Blender, some basic knowledge of Blender's interface, and maybe a snack. You can watch the whole thing here on YouTube, or if you prefer, jump on over to the CG Boost Academy, where it is separated into trackable bite-sized lessons. You get all of the project files to reference, it's in a clean, distraction-free environment, and best of all, there is a team of artists ready to answer any question you may have. So join for free over at cgboost.com/frogbot. Still here? Okay, let's get started. So you've downloaded Blender from the Blender website and you open the program and you are faced with the default Blender. But before we jump into the course, we need to enable a few native add-ons. Now, they don't enable anything that Blender couldn't already do itself, they just speed up our workflow significantly. We have extra mesh objects. This gives us more objects to start with. Bool tool. This dramatically speeds up our Boolean operations, where we use one object to cut another object, and Node Wrangler, a set of handy shortcuts for setting up, you've guessed it, nodes. But don't worry if you're not a fan of nodes, because the materials can be pretty simple, because a lot of the appeal comes from the design and animation. However, you can also take advantage of the materials from Robotic Planet to add a little bit more detail. So to activate these add-ons, we can go up to Edit, Preferences, move over to the Get Extension tab, and to make sure we have the most up-to-date versions, we're going to allow online access. Now we can search for extra mesh objects, and click Install, search for Bool tool, again click Install, and search for Node Wrangler. Now you may not have this in your Get Extensions section, so we need to move one tab down to the add-ons, as this is already in Blender, just not activated. So let's again search for Node Wrangler, and here we can just tick or check the box here to enable. Okay, now you're all set up to follow along, and we'll dive into the functions of these add-ons in the following chapters. So to get a feel for the size of our frog, we're going to first use our default cube here to create roughly the shape and size of a human. And to do so, a nice way to start is to jump into edit mode with tab on the keyboard over the 3D viewport, hit G to grab the mesh, and Z to lock it to the Z axis, and then 1 on the keyboard to move the mesh up 1 meter. And also getting our origin point right on the floor here. Now, if we hit N on the keyboard to open up our side panel, we can see we can dial in the dimensions manually. And I happen to know the average size of a human is about 1.65 meters. So that is the height. And then we can just tweak the other variables. So we basically have a bounding box for a human. Okay, now we can hit F2 and name it human scale. And hit G, and we're just going to move it on the x-axis along the side here. So this is our reference. Now the other reference we need is the concept image, the sketch of our Frogbot. So to do that, I'm just going to hit N on the keyboard to hide our side panel here and move my cursor right up to the top right of the viewport until the cursor changes into this little crosshair here. Then we can click and drag out for a new window. I'm just going to divide it like so and change our left window from 3D viewport to image editor. Now we can click Open, hunt down our file, and select and open image. Now with our image open, it's also good practice just to click this shield icon here so that Blender knows to store it in the blend file even though it's not being used as a texture. Okay, we're all set up. Let's start blocking out this Frogbot. First of all, I'm going to switch on over to the orthographic view by using this icon here. This enables us to compare the frog scale we're going to create without perspective distorting our view. So to start with, we have a wedge shape here for our Frogbot. Quite simple, and I think we can start with a cube. So Shift and A, Mesh, Cube. Now we can do what we did before by jumping into edit mode with Tab, and then G, Z1 to move it up 1 meter and have our origin nicely along the floor here. Then we can scale it down in object mode and scale it down roughly to the size of a frog. And I'm going to adjust by scaling along the Z axis here with S and Z. And I appreciate that it isn't a frog, it's a robot frog, so it could be theoretically any size, but we're going to go with something that is roughly the size of a frog. And I'm going to scale it in along the X with S and X. And that feels about right to me. Now, if we hit N on the keyboard, we can see our dimensions here, but we can also see that our scale is non-uniform. And this doesn't really cause us any issues now, but will cause us issues with modifiers in the future. And a quick example as to why this is important, we have our cube here with a uniform scale and a cube here with a very non-uniform scale on the X. Now let's jump over to our modifiers and add a bevel on one, and the same with the other. And you can see our modifier result is scaled much like the object, stretching it greatly on the X-axis. So to preempt that issue, with our object selected, we can do Control and A and apply the scale, and this unifies everything to 1. This can also be achieved by moving up to the Object menu, Apply, and Scale. Now we can hit N on the keyboard to hide our sidebar. And we're also done with our human scale here. Now we can click and drag is with it selected, hit M, create a new collection, call that collection Hide, create, and then over in our outliner, just uncheck it. So we can go back to it at any time, but we also don't have it clogging up our 3D viewport. Okay, let's create that tapered look. So selecting our cube here into edit mode, and we're going to go to Edge Select, which is 2 on the number row, or up here in the menu. And we can select the far edge, hit G to grab and Y to lock to the Y axis, and move it in until we're happy. Back out into object mode with tab on the keyboard. Now for the eyes, this will be fairly simple. We can shift and right click to drop our 3D cursor. This will be where our new objects are placed. Shift and A, mesh, and UV sphere. And then S to scale it down. Now for the cylinder, which is in effect the upper leg. Again, we're going to shift and right click and shift and A, mesh, cylinder. And again, we're going to scale it down. And this time hit R and rotate along the Y 90 degrees. And that's just typing it out on the keyboard. Now we can scale it down along the X, roughly here. And in order to position it more accurately, I'm going to orbit around the model with middle click while holding Alt so it snaps to the various axes. Now we can hit G and move it out like so. And again, orbit around with Alt to snap. And I think we can scale things down a little bit and position it like so. Now, in order to create these elements on the other side, we can simply use a mirror modifier. So with the eye selected, let's go over to modifiers and search for mirror. And the object we want to mirror around is our frogbot body here. Now we can left click the upper leg or cylinder, shift click the eye, and with this little downward arrow, click it and copy to selected. This copies the modifier and its associated settings over to the new object. And finally, we want our foot here, and this time we're going to use the Draw Primitive tool, which is over here in the left-hand menu. So let's select that. And here we can just click and drag out our foot shape and extrude it up like so. It's a little bit off for me, so I'm just going to again orbit and snap to a view here and position it like so. Now we want that to be tapered slightly too. So I'm just going to go back to our border select, jump into edit mode, 3 on the number row or up here in the menu, and select the poly and scale with S on the keyboard and X to restrict it to the X axis. Okay, we have our objects all set up. So let's also copy the mirror over to our foot. And another way to do this is to select our foot, shift select any object with the modifier we want, and then Control L. And then we can move over to copy modifiers. Right, now let's look at the proportions of our bot. We can switch back on over to perspective here to get an idea of what it would look like with a real camera. We can also hit N on the keyboard and go down to View and change our focal length. As this is a small animal, it's more than likely that it would be filmed in the real world with a longer lens, as if you were zooming in to get closer. So let's go with 100mm to get a better representation of what it would look like. Okay, not too bad. This is our opportunity to tweak proportions. So for a start, I'm going to select the feet here in edit mode, select the front poly, and I'm going to hit G twice to slide it along an edge. Here we can make it slightly smaller. Going to switch to orthographic mode and make sure it isn't intersecting with anything. Then A to select all and S to scale along the X axis, and G and X and move it in a bit. And you can also hit 5 on your number pad, should you have one, in order to switch between orthographic and perspective. This performs the exact same function as clicking this button. Back out into object mode and I'm reasonably happy, except the body for me is looking a little bit too wide. So let's tab into edit mode and then hit A to select everything and S and X to scale along the X, holding Shift for finer control. Then left click to commit. Back out into object mode, we can select all of our objects with Shift and left click, snap to the front view, and hit G and move them in to accommodate that new scale. That feels nice to me. Oh, we're intersecting ever so slightly here with our foot. I'm just going to G and move it out like so. Cool. Okay, we have our proportions roughly in place, so now let's look at refining the model. There are a number of ways to add bevels in Blender, and one of the easiest ones is with our object selected, jumping into edit mode with tab, moving across to our edge selection here, selecting an edge and then hitting Ctrl and B. And then with our scroll wheel, we can add more sections. However, once we have committed to that, there's no going back. We can't adjust things, not easily anyway. This makes things destructive, and we want to keep things non-destructive. So instead of editing the mesh, we're going to jump back out into object mode with tab and use a bevel modifier over here in the modifier options. So we can click add modifier and search for bevel, and you can see it adds a bevel, well, to every edge pretty much based on the tolerance of this angle here. In order to address specific edges, we want to change the limit method from angle to weight. Now this modifier needs us to assign edge weights to specific edges. So we can do that in edit mode by going into tab, and with that same edge selected here, you can hit Ctrl and E. This brings up the edge context menu, and we can see here edge bevel weight. And if we click that and move our cursor away, you can see we have control of that edge bevel. So I think we can go pretty strong on that. Let's choose that. Select the back edge here, Ctrl E, edge bevel weight. Again, very strong on that. Looks good. You can also edit the edge bevels numerically by hitting N on the keyboard, and under Item, you can see Edge Data Bevel Weight. And we can always go back to our bevel modifier, increase segments. I'm going to go all the way up to 8. And you also have the amount here. So we could do a, if you like, global operation to adjust the strength. I'm quite happy with that. So let's jump back into edit mode with tab, select the bottom here, Ctrl and E, edge bevel weight, give this one quite a strong one. So it kind of aligns with the contours of the cylinder or upper legs. And then at the back here, Ctrl and E, edge bevel weight. Let's give it something a little bit more restricted. Cool, we have our bevels in place. And I'm going to up the resolution ever so slightly more to 12 segments. Now, the other thing that seems quite unnatural is the fact that our edges are super duper harsh, impossibly sharp, if you will. So we can add an additional bevel modifier to fix that. So if we go to add modifier and again search for bevel, and this time we want to keep the angle method. Now we can click and drag in the amount field to reduce the amount of bevel, holding Shift while we do so to increase the sensitivity. And let's increase segments as well to 6. I'm just going to dial the amount down here. Let's go something like 3. You can also do 3 millimeters, which has the same effect. Now, you can see it's looking better, but we are also getting this faceted look, this stepped shading, if you will. We can fix that by going right-click, Shade Smooth. And we can go one step further to make sure all our surfaces are nice and rigid by under the bevel, the second bevel here, checking Harden Normals. You can see it's subtle, but it just makes sure that we don't have any, at least from a shading perspective, bulging. Okay, we have our smooth bevels. Now we can look at cutting out shapes with Booleans. But first, a super quick overview of the Bool tool and Boolean operations. So we want to use this cube to cut a shape out of this other cube. So first we have to select the object that will do the cutting, and then we can shift select the object we want to cut. Now hitting Ctrl, Shift and B brings up the Bool tool menu. And here we have 4 options. Difference, which cuts the source mesh out of the target mesh. Union, which adds the source mesh to the target mesh, removing the interior faces. Intersect, which keeps the overlapping section. And Slice, which performs a difference and intersect Boolean, so you have overall the same shape, but with 2 objects and a slice. Now, it may not have escaped your notice that there are 2 sections, one auto and one brush. And the difference is quite simple. The auto runs the Boolean modifier and then applies the Boolean modifier. The brush option runs the modifier and doesn't apply anything, giving us the option to edit and tweak as needed. So that's enough theory, let's put it into practice. Okay, let's start looking at using some Boolean modifiers to create the nice paneling effect on our concept sketch. And to start with, we can tackle the one up here. So in order to do so, we need a cutting object, and we can start with a cube. And in order to place the cube smack dab in the middle, we can select our object here, hit Tab to go into edit mode, and then on the poly select, just select the very top poly here, and then use Shift and S. And this will bring our selection pie menu up, and we can choose cursor to selected. This moves our cursor right in the middle of that polygon, which helps us a lot when we jump back out into object mode, either with Tab or Control Tab here, which activates the pie menu, and then Shift and A, Mesh Cube, which again is far too big. So let's hit S and scale it way down. Something like that looks good. Let's just have a look around. Ooh, we need to scale it along the Y a little bit to cover the back. So S and Y. Excellent, that's enough. And we also have these nice little bevels here. But before we add those, we need to apply our scale, again because of complications when it comes to calculating modifiers and operations. So to apply our scale, we can just do Control A, apply, scale. Now we can jump into edit mode and add these little bevels here. So tab into edit mode, 2 on the number row, or selecting edges up here. And we can select this edge, shift and left click to select this edge. And we're going to do a destructive bevel here. So Control and B and draw out the bevel. If yours looks more like this, then you may need to scroll your scroll wheel all the way down just so we have the one segment. Jumping back out into object mode, and we have our cutter all ready to go. Now we can shift select the body of our frog, Control, Shift and B to activate our Bool tool. And then we're going to use the brush Boolean because we want it non-destructive so we can edit it afterwards. And we want slice. Okay, now we have our 2 objects here and our cutter, which has been handily converted to a bounds view. If you're interested, you can always switch this back by going into Object Properties, Viewport Display, and then Display As, and here you have bounds, but you also have wire, solid, and textured being the default. Okay, we have our cut, but what we don't have is the bevel affecting the cut also. And this is an order of operations issue, because if we jump back to our modifiers here, you can see we have the two bevels and then our Boolean. The first bevel is the larger bevels, the second bevel is the little micro bevels, and then our Boolean. So what we want to do is have our micro bevels happen after the Boolean operation. And if we drop here, our bevel is happening after the Boolean, but the bevel width has shrunk. Okay, let's look at why our bevel has shrunk. If we select one of the objects and just toggle down our bevel, you can see under the geometry option here, we have the option clamp overlap. If we uncheck it, we get our original bevel width back. However, it looks like we have some geometry errors. This is easier to see if we move up to our viewport overlays and check wireframe. While we are making things easier to see, if we select our cutter object and move to object properties, scroll down, and under viewport display, let's display as wire. This enables us to see the edges here, which are causing the issue, mainly because the edge of our cutter is very, very close to the edge of our target geometry. So if I were to move it with G and Z, you can see as we get those edges closer together, the bevel gets incredibly small on the clamped version. However, we can move it in between, so keeping it as far away from each edge as possible, and we have a slightly better result. So let's jump back out into object mode. I'm just going to re-enable the clamp overlap, and we're still getting some reduction in our bevel. Just check the rear side. Nope, those edges are completely clear of any of our target edges. So another thing we can do, instead of making the edge as far away from the two other edges as possible, we can basically get it so close that there's a calculation rounding error that treats the cutter and target vertices as one. And there it is, very nice. And now we have our nice wide bevel back. Okay, time for the next Boolean cut, and this will be the mouth section, which is a little bit more complex. And to do this, we can start with a cylinder, as we have a sort of circular profile right at the bottom of the body here. So initially, we want our cylinder lower down, so what we can do is snap our cursor with Shift and S to world origin, and this just places it right in the middle of our scene. Then we can Shift and A, mesh, cylinder, and then S and scale it down like so. Then we want to hit R to rotate, Y to lock in the axis, and then type 90 to dial in the angle. And scale it along the X just so it covers the entire width of the body. Now we can move it into place with G on the keyboard, making sure that the edge of the cylinder protrudes beyond the edge of our body here, because we will be using it as a cutter and it needs full coverage. That looks good to me. So let's jump into edit mode, and here we can start selecting polygons to extrude up. I think those 4 will suffice. And we can hit E, which extrudes along the normal by default. But if we hit Z and then Z again, it will choose our global Z axis. So let's commit to that extrude and scale, and Z, and then 0 to flatten out that profile, and then G and Z maybe to move it up ever so slightly. Okay, that is the sort of whistle shape of our cutter sorted out. But the issue we had before, where the edges were getting very close together, is going to happen to us again. So as a preventative measure, we are going to remove some of those edges. And to do so, we can go into edit mode. And with 2 on the number row or edge selection, we can hold Alt and left click to select a loop of edges. And we can do the same with the others by Shift and Alt left click to multiple select. And then we hit X and we can dissolve the edges. This removes them without destroying the surrounding geometry. And now we have a much simpler object which will cut things out way cleaner. Right, we're nearly done, but we have this little inset for the mouth, and we can create that with a loop cut. So we're basically cutting all the way down the middle with Control and R. And as soon as we get to an edge, you can see the cut that is going to happen. So let's left click, and then it gives us the option to slide, but we don't really want to slide, so we can right click to basically ignore that option. Now we want our cut either side really, so let's just use a bevel, like so. And then still in edge selection mode, we're going to Alt and left click to select these two edges again and perform another bevel. And I think you can see where we're going here. Let's just jump into poly select mode and select the top poly here, hit G and Z, and pull up the shape like so. And that is pretty much our cutter already sorted out. So let's perform this Boolean operation and see how we go. Right, our cutter is selected, and then we shift select to select the body, Control Shift and B, and again we want slice, and we want our micro bevel to be at the end of the operation here. So let's go over to our modifiers. I'm just collapsing them down with this smaller toggle on the left. Instead of just dragging it down like so, we can use the toggle here and pin it to last. So any modifiers we add now will be before this end micro bevel modifier. All right, that's looking good. Let's do the same with the body here. Pin to last. Cool, that looks good to me. All right, we're not totally done with the mouth though. We have this intersecting panel here. With our cursor still in the middle, let's create a mesh cube. Scale it way down. Hit G, and we're going to scale it up and then scale it on everything but the X. So S to scale, then Shift and X, making sure it covers the entire door or mouth. And as we scaled in object mode, we need to do Control and A and apply scale. Now we can hold Shift and select the mouth, Control Shift and B, and then slice. And this should cause no issues because the cube's edges and vertices are very far away from our target edges and vertices, and therefore overlapping geometry is unlikely. But let's see. Huzzah! Okay, we only have a couple more Boolean operations to go, and one we want for the eye, specifically so we can animate it going into the body and it doesn't just sort of disappear. So to create the cutter, we basically want a cylinder, and we can use the existing geometry of the eyes as a starting point. So before we do anything else, let's duplicate the eyes so we're not destroying our eye shapes. Shift and D to duplicate. It attaches automatically to the cursor, but we can hit right click to drop it back where it's supposed to be. Then we can use / to go into local view. This is also available from View, Local View, Toggle Local View. And it doesn't delete any of our geometry, it just temporarily hides it. Now we can jump into edit mode and look at selecting the geometry that would be our cylinder end caps. So for that, we can jump into edge mode, Alt and left click one side of the sphere, Shift and Alt click the opposing side of the sphere, and then Shift and D to duplicate that edge, and right click to drop. This time we can do Control and I to fully invert the selection. So we're selecting everything but that new circle we just created, then X and delete vertices, the fundamental data of our geometry to ensure that everything selected has gone. Jumping back out into object mode, and we are left with 2 circles here, but the only reason there are 2 is because of our mirror modifier. So let's jump into our modifier options and apply the mirror modifier like so. Then we can jump back into edit mode, making sure we are still on edge selection. Select all those edges with A on the keyboard, then right click to bring up our context menu specifically for edges, and then select bridge edge loops. Now we just need to add end caps here. So 2 on the number row just to make sure we are in edge selection, then Alt and left click an edge. F for fill. Do the same the other side, Alt left click and F. So let's jump out of isolation mode with /. And there's our cutter, but it is dangerously close to the surface here, and that could result in calculation errors. So what we can do is scale it, but we want to scale it from the center point, and our origin point is all the way over here on the right. Thankfully, that's an easy fix. With it selected, we can go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry, and that puts it bang in the middle. Now we can scale X and move it out so it is way beyond the bounds and won't have any of those calculation errors. and then we can apply scale for good measure. Now we have our cutter and we're ready to cut. Shift select the body, Control Shift B, and we want a difference cut. And pay attention to the edges here. Let's see if they shrink at all. They do. That's annoying. Okay, we have the same issue with our bevel edges being restricted, being a little bit smaller. And this time it's due to how Blender adds some support edges to accommodate our new Boolean operation. So let's select the body of our frog and go into local view with /. And what we can do is effectively add additional support edges to the original geometry so Blender doesn't have to guess, causing these very, very thin polygons. So in order to do so, let's jump into edit mode with tab, and we're going to use the loop cut with Control and R, and we're going to cut an edge here, and you can see as we move along and start intersecting with our eye Boolean cut, we're starting to solve the issue. So let's choose a cut like that, which happens to be in the middle of two vertices here, so it isn't causing any interruption or poly overlap when the bevel happens. And we've effectively fixed our edge width. We are onto our final Boolean operation, huzzah, and that is the vent/nose section here. And to do that, we can simply use a cube, and we can use our make primitive tool here. As it's set here, we can see it is snapping and oriented to surface, so we can just draw it straight on our surface. So going to select here, draw a profile like that, and extrude it out. There we go. Let's move it in so it's actually cutting something. So G and Y, moving it in like so. And we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We could duplicate them, but we could also take advantage of the array modifier. So with the object selected, let's go to add modifier and search for array. And that has created an offset along the X axis here, which we don't want. In fact, let's just hit the N key. Yeah, that isn't the X axis. It has got some rotation pre-applied due to the add primitive tool drawing upwards from the surface of our frogbot mesh. So with Control and A, we can apply our rotation. And that zeroes everything out here. And you can see the X-axis now makes sense. Now we could adjust the offset of our array here in the modifier, but we could also use the new gizmo option here. So let's drag out the offset, making sure we have a count of 6 in the array modifier. It's pretty good. Let's move it in ever so slightly. Cool. I'm happy with that. And that is our cutter. So let's shift select our body, Control Shift B, and we just want a difference brush here. And it looks like something is amiss. So let's hit N to hide the control panel and Alt Shift and Z, which hides all our overlays, the same as clicking this button. And we can see on the 6th cutout here, we have the same issue as before where the support edges are causing geometry errors. And we can fix it in the same way. With our body selected, going into edit mode, Control R for a loop cut, make sure we are in the middle of our Boolean operation for the nose and the middle of the Boolean operation for the eye, because we have to remember both things now. Okay, so let's move up to our viewport overlays and uncheck our wireframes. In fact, we can switch them all off with Alt Shift and Z and give our robot a better look. Okay, looking good. Now Booleans, I'm sure you will admit, can be quite painful. So if you find yourself still having issues, we have another video that troubleshoots all manner of Boolean problems. Link in the description. But if you're good, let's move on to the next part. Right, time to add an antenna so our frogbot can receive all of the radio frequencies it needs. Before we jump into that, we're going to clean up our 3D viewport here because we still have a lot of these cutters displayed. And as you can see, if we move on over to our outliner, we do have a collection for the Boolean cutters, which was set up with the bool tool as an automatic process. However, the objects that reside within that collection also are contained in our main scene collection. As you can see here, when I select them, a reference of them is outside of that collection too. So to ensure they are all in this collection, we can right-click that collection, go to Select Objects, then over in our 3D viewport here, we can hit M to move to collection and then select Boolean Cutters. Now they are all in that collection. We don't see that odd duplication outside anymore. And we can uncheck the collection to hide them all without removing their function. Now we are free to add our antenna in the form of a curve. But first, let's set our origin point up and we can use the existing geometry like we did before. So selecting the object here, tab into edit mode, 3 on the number row or up here to select poly select, click the top poly, shift and S, and then down to cursor to selection, and then back out into object mode. Now we can shift an A to add a curve, Bezier. Now, if we scroll out here, you can see that it is huge. And what I prefer to do is to jump into edit mode with tab, hit A, making sure everything is selected, X, delete all vertices, and then draw it in afterwards. So still in edit mode here, let's snap to a side view by holding down Alt, and we're going to select our draw tool from the toolbar here. If you don't see the toolbar, you can hit T on the keyboard, which shows and hides the toolbar. And then we can just draw in our curve, like so. And as you can see here, we have the perfect amount of points. This rarely happens. Normally, there'll be 3 or 4, and we'll need to select with our selection tool here any of them in the middle because we want to keep this as simple as possible, and hit X and delete. And then we can hit A to select both of our points here. And to ensure the Bezier handles are even, this just gives us the smoothest curve. We can hit V on the keyboard to bring up our set handle type and set it to automatic. You can do the same as well if we go up to control points, handle type, automatic. And now we can dial in our curve by selecting the root here. Just going to rotate, making sure this one is vertical. And the endpoint here, I'm going to rotate until we have a nice curve. And then hit G, I'm going to move it down ever so slightly too. And scale maybe a little. Let's see what that looks like. I think it could be a little bit larger, so I'm going to move it up along the Z. Cool, that looks good to me. And finally, I'm going to, in object mode, hit G and Y and move it back so it is in the middle of our 2 bevels here, just so it's just nice and central. Okay, that's looking good, but it is incredibly thin. So thin that it won't even render, so we need to add some geometry. Just going to bring up our options here, switch on over to our curve options, and under geometry here, we have the option of bevel depth. Now I'm going to shift and click because this is going to be a quite sensitive field to adjust. And I think a value of 0.001 looks nice to me. Again, I'm just doing Shift, Alt, and Z to hide our overlays. Just gives a better impression of what the end result will look like. Okay, with that done, let's add the snazzy little ball here on top. To start with, let's drop our cursor where we want the ball to be. So if we jump into edit mode, select our topmost point here, Shift and S, cursor to selected, back out into object mode with tab, then Control and A, and we want a mesh round cube, as it's a sphere of all quads and has slightly better shading. If you don't see this option, you will need to enable the extra mesh objects add-on, which we did earlier on in the course. Okay, with that selected, we have a ginormous sphere here. So let's hit S and scale it down into place. Something like that looks good. And again, just for due diligence, Control and A, apply scale. Going to Shift, Alt, and Z again. That looks good, maybe a little bit larger. Yep, looks nice. Again, Control A, apply scale. And from here on out as well, the wireframes are actually more of a hindrance because we are working with quite small elements. So I'm going to go up to my viewport overlays and just uncheck them from the geometry options here. Much better. Now the only thing that is remaining, which is a bit off-putting, is this perfect intersection here between the antenna and the body of our robot. So let's add a joining element to mask that intersection. We can start by selecting the object and then moving our cursor to selection with Shift and S, Shift and A, add a cylinder. We're going to scale it all way down, way down, have it ever so slightly larger than our antenna curve here. And I'm going to move it into place by hitting G, then Shift and Z to move it on every axis but the Z axis, and align it into place. Then G and Z to move it only on the Z axis up to a point like this, and we can apply scale, hit Tab to go into edit mode. I want to select the bottom poly, which we can do in wireframe, so holding Z, bringing up our pie menu, selecting wireframe, making sure we are in poly mode. Just going to select that bottom poly, hit Z, go into solid mode again, and scale up like so. So we have this sort of connected, rubberized element, I would imagine it to be. Still in edit mode, and we can hit A to select all, then S to scale, but also Shift and Z to scale on everything but the Z axis. Now we can cut out the center by selecting the top poly and switching to wireframe in order to easily select the bottom poly, back to solid mode, and then I on the keyboard to inset that polygon. And then in order to join the two sections, we can switch to wireframe with Z on the keyboard. To enable us to see the opposing side of this geometry, we can right click, bridge faces, and you can see the effect that has. Jumping back out into solid mode and into object mode, we can add a little bit of a bevel here by going over to our modifiers, add modifier, search for bevel. Let's go with 0.1 millimeter. That looks nicer. Add one more segment. We still have the faceted look as well. So let's right click, shade smooth. And in our bevel modifier under shading, we want to harden the normals so we get the nice flat sides. And while we're at it, because we have faceting up here as well, we can right click and shade smooth. And there we have our Frogbot antenna. Now we can move on to the eyes. I don't know about you, but it's nice to take a break now and again, make a hot drink and look off into the distance. Wait, what's that? Of course, it's the robots from Robotic Planet, each with a unique mechanism and character. It's a course, just like this one, but way more. We learn how to build procedural materials from scratch, as well as jet thrusters and LCD displays. We look at hard surfaces with curved edges, rigging and automation techniques for claws, hydraulics, speakers, EQ displays, and more, all wrapped up in workflows and best practices to retain control and quality throughout. Given you've got this far already, I feel confident in saying this is kind of your thing. So as a student of this course, you can get 10% discount by using the code ROBOT10 at checkout. To find out more, check out the link in the description. Now back to the course. I'm not particularly up on my frog anatomy, and I don't think I have to be, because we're not talking about a frog here. We're talking about a robot frog, which is completely different. Having said that though, we still need to refer to the eye elements, so I'm going to refer to the black section of the eye as the pupil, and the yellow section of the eye as the iris. So in order to create this distinction, we could do so in a shader material, but because we'd like this sort of paneled robotic look, we're going to create actual distinct geometry between the pupil and the iris. And we already have a pretty good framework to do so with our block out objects here. But before we continue, let's just check if the scale is looking right. So N on the keyboard, and yes, we have scaled down our object and not applied scale. This will make things like adding a bevel of 1 millimeter look completely off. So again, we should Ctrl and A and apply our scale, resetting all of those factors to 1, and N on the keyboard to hide. Now, in order to separate the pupil section, we can use these handy edge loops that are already present, but they are aligned to the wrong axis. So if we jump into edit mode with Tab, make sure everything is selected with A, and then hit R, lock it to the Y with Y, and then type in 90. Now we are in the perfect position to start selecting loops of polys to the extent to cover our pupil. So to do that, making sure we are in poly select mode here, I'm going to go up to an edge, hold down Alt and left click, and that selects our loop. Now we can just expand our selection either by going up to select, select more and less, and then more, or by Control and the number pad plus. So I think that is a reasonable amount for the pupil. And to separate the geometry, we're just going to hit P and by selection. Now, if we hit Tab and go back out into object mode, we have two objects, the iris and the pupil here. I don't know about you, but the eyes seem a little bit faceted and the shading isn't the best. So let's just shift click both, right click, shade smooth, and now work on the look of our eye. Firstly, with the iris here. So I'm just going to select the pupil and hit H to hide, select our iris element here, and we're going to add more fidelity with modifiers. Firstly, add modifier. We're going to search for a subdivision surface that smooths out the faceting that we could see on the silhouette here. With the viewport level of 1 and the render level of 2, I think we're smooth enough here and quite close in, so we don't really need that additional level, so I'm going to drop that back down to 1. Now it's impossibly thin, so let's add a solidify with add modifier and searching for solidify, and that is already insetting nicely with our thickness value here. And for our final modifier, we want a bevel modifier. So let's add modifier bevel, and I'm going to go up to our viewport overlays and temporarily switch on wireframe so we can see what we're doing. And the bevel amount, let's go with 1mm. Looks nice, maybe one more segment there. And again, like before, we can drop down our shading tab and just make sure we have hard normals on. Let's switch off our wireframes. That's looking like a much cleaner model. Now, if we hit Alt and H, we unhide our pupil section here, and we have done a considerable amount of work on our iris section, but thankfully we can easily copy it across by selecting our pupil, shift selecting our iris, hitting Control and L to bring up the link data menu, and then just click copy modifiers. And all of those fancy modifiers we just set up are copied across. And that's our eyeballs done. Okay, moving on to the legs, which include this wheel element and our foot. But if we move over to our concept art here, it is simple, almost too simple, I'd say. So what we can do here, I'm just going to hover the cursor over the image editor, Control and space to go into full screen, hit T for the toolbar, and N for the side panel. We're going to add a little bit more detail to our concept sketch with the annotation tool. Firstly, I think a nice sort of axle here, or a paneled element. Just switching over to a white color here. And then on the toe element here, I think we can actually add some toes. Something like that could be nice. So it gets inset, and then this is deleted. And then right in here, I think it would be nice to add something that alludes to a mechanical connection to the wheel. So let's take that into consideration while building up our model. I'm just going to shift and space out of full screen and again hit T and N to hide the panels. Let's first start with the wheel element here, and we already have from our blocked out geometry a good starting point. So let's hit Tab to go into edit mode. And we can scale down along the Y here to create something roughly the width here. I'm just going to snap to front view holding Alt and middle click, and then hit G and X and move it on across so it's nearly touching, but not quite. Then we can do Shift and D to duplicate that geometry. Move it out like so. Shift and D to duplicate the geometry again, tapping X to lock to that X axis. And we can bring that in between the two other wheels and then scale it down. Now you may need to go into wireframe. So let's just commit to a small scale, hit Z and go to wireframe, and then scale along the X axis like so. Out into object mode with Tab. Now we can jump back into solid mode. Let's create this axle panel here, making sure we are in edit mode and poly select. Let's select the front face here, and we're going to hit L over the keyboard with our cursor over this mesh element, and that will select all of the polygons in that mesh element. Now we can hit Shift and H to hide everything else but that element, and then select the larger faces on either side. Hit I to inset, and let's create an inset like that. Now we want to create a separate element for the inner circle here, and we can do so separating it without creating new objects by hitting Y. And now if we move the elements here, you can see they are separate, and we're free to scale them down a little more so, but scale them on everything apart from our X-axis. So S to scale, Shift and X, and then bring it in ever so slightly, like that. Now with them still selected here, we can bridge the edges with right-click, bridge faces, and you can see what we're doing there, but we're still missing one element here, and that is the larger wheel isn't a true watertight mesh. And when I say watertight mesh, I mean that we can see on the inside there's holes. So we can actually make that even more apparent by moving up to our viewport overlay and just check face orientation. And you can see we're looking at the back side of the polygons, but we can solve that by moving up to our edge selection tool, or 2 on the number row, holding Alt, selecting a loop here, doing the same the other side. And let's just confirm we've got those 2 selections in wireframe. And then right click again, bridge edge loops. Back out into object mode and we can see the progress we have made. Now it still has this faceted look, so let's look at cleaning up that next. First of all, I don't think we have enough geometry here for the circle, so we can add additional geometry by using a subdivision surface. So over in our modifiers, add subdivision surface. Now this looks like it has gone horribly wrong, and in effect it has, but we can remedy this with edge creasing. So if we go into edit mode, and as you can see we still only have parts visible, so Alt and H just make sure we see everything. Then in edge selection, selecting an edge here, and we can select all other edges where the faces have a similar angle, and we can do that with Shift and G, face angles. That selects everything. You can see our threshold here, and now we can activate our crease, and the shortcut to do so is Shift and E, and then drag our cursor out, and you can see the effect here. That crease variable is also available from the side panel. Hitting N on the keyboard under Item, you can see the crease level here. So now we have a resolution slider here where we can always increase the fidelity if we were to say get very close, but I think a level of 1 on our viewport and render is good. And to further clean up the faceted look, we can right click, shade smooth, and also shift and click another element with a bevel, and take the bevel here at the end, the toggle down, and just copy to selected. And it doesn't look anywhere near as nice as our original bevel here, and this, you may have noted, is because we haven't got that applied scale, and this is a prime example of why it's so important to apply that scale. So let's do that now with Control and A, apply scale, and we have our bevel back. It's looking a little bit strong, so let's just go in here, and I think we can go down to 0.001. That feels about right to me. Cool, now onto the foot. Okay, let's move on to the feet, and you will note here that it already has a nice uniform scale, so we do not have to worry about it this time. And we're not going to use booleans this time to create these nice cutouts. We're going to add supporting geometry and use extrude. So if we hit N on the keyboard just to hide that sidebar, selecting the toe going into edit mode, Control and R for a loop cut, getting near an edge to activate, and we're going to scroll up once because we want 2 loop cuts. Left click to select. If you happen to move, we can always right click to drop. Now in poly select mode here, selecting this front poly and hitting E to extrude. And as you can see, if we do, we have an issue. We have what is described as a non-manifold mesh, which basically means that it isn't watertight. It has holes. You can see the back face. It has issues. So let's not do it that way. But Blender does have a pretty cool way of solving this, as if by magic. You can see we have our regular extrude, but we also have extrude manifold. And if we were to do that, extruding it in, looks much the same at the moment, but as soon as we release, as if by magic, it fixes up all of our geometry for us. So let's do the same for the back here. Extrude like so. Now this hasn't done quite as good a job, particularly with welding the vertices here, but it shouldn't really matter because this object won't deform in any way, and as long as it receives the bevel okay, then we should be good. So let's check that now by going into object mode, add modifier, search for bevel. That looks pretty good. Let's add one more segment and reduce the amount down to 1 millimeter. Right click, shade smooth, and under the shading option of the modifier, make sure to harden the normals. Excellent, looks pretty good, but we need to have that connected element, so let's create that now from our foot geometry. So jumping in 3 on the number row or up here for poly select, we can use our poly here as an initial piece of geometry, so Shift and D, move it back along the Y, I'm going to scale it down a bit, and then we don't want our manifold extrude here. We could just use our regular one or hitting E on the keyboard to extrude the geometry back. And then G and Y, maybe to go a little bit further. Back out into object mode. I'm going to add a little bit of visual distinction by going into local view mode with /. And then in edit mode here, we're going to select edges with 2 on the number row. And instead of hitting Alt and left click, we're going to hit Alt Control and left click to select the ring of edges. I'm just going to move us over to the select tool here so we hide our extrude gizmo. Now we can do a bevel here, like so, and I think that just creates a nice unique piece of geometry. We're back into object mode, and we're jumping out of local view, and we can see that the wheel doesn't really properly align. Not a big problem. Let's just hit G and X, move our foot geometry out till it aligns nicely with one side. Then select our wheel here, going into edit mode, snapping to the front with Alt, going into wireframe with Z and wireframe, and I'm going to switch to vertices here and just select everything one side, move in for a closer look, maybe switch back to solid for this, G and X, and move it out until it is flush like so. And there we have it, our Frogbot model is finished, with our next step being to add some snazzy materials. Adding materials can be as simple as firing up our viewport shading, moving over to our render options in order to enable ray tracing, which gives us a slightly better look here. Then selecting an object, going to material options, clicking new, giving it a name, let's go with green 1, and selecting a base color. Something like that could be nice. However, I'm going to use procedural materials from Robotic Planet. These materials benefit from edge wear, dirt, and scratches, and were made step by step in the Robotic Planet course. However, if you haven't enrolled in that course, you can still access them by signing up for the free course on cgboost.com/frogbot. With that blend file downloaded, you can store it in a easily accessible folder. I've just called this one Blender Assets. Then in Blender, we can go up to Edit, Preferences, and all the way down to File Paths. And we can add a new asset library and hunt down the folder you just created, Blender Assets, and then Add Asset Library. Now we can close down our preferences. I'm just going to drag up our timeline here and change it from timeline over to Asset Browser. And here you will see the Robotic Planet elements. So let's select Robotic Planet material, and we want our base material here. But you can see we also have import settings. If we click that, we have import method and have a number of options. Link. When using this setting, a material will be locked from any adjustment, as it only references it from the blend file we downloaded. Pack. This function is very similar to link, but also stores the material in the blend file. Handy if the blend file we downloaded was accidentally deleted. And append. Here, a full copy of the material will be stored in our Frogbot blend file and allows us to fully customize it to our liking. Because we want that easy editability, I'm going to keep it on append. Now we can select our base material and start dragging it over the object we want. And after selecting the object, going to material options, we can change the color to our liking. So let's choose something in the similar ballpark to our concept sketch. Here we can use the base alt for the secondary material. Again, tweaking the color by selecting the object, object properties, and adjusting like so. That looks good. Now it is worth noting that each time we drag in a material, we are effectively creating a duplicate of said material in our Blender file. In order to avoid that, we can link over the current material, say to this object, by selecting it, shift selecting the object we want to source the material from, then hitting Ctrl L and moving to link materials. Here, this now ensures that they are using the exact same material, and this is denoted by this number here, signifying that two objects are using this material. Let's do the same up here by selecting this top panel, shift selecting the main body, Ctrl L, link materials. And for the feet as well, selecting them, shift selecting the mouth part, Ctrl L, link materials. Moving up to the top here, I think we can have a metallic look to our antenna. So let's drag over our metal material. And for the ball on the top here, I think we can go with the same green. So shift select the body here, Ctrl L, link material. This joining element can be black. So let's select base black. The eye here can use that same black. So let's select it, shift select the join, Ctrl L, link material. Now the iris, which is yellow, can use a new material. So we can drag out another base here over the top. And it is, as you can see, named base 001 as opposed to just base. And we don't have a number next to it because it is only referenced on this one object. So let's change it to iris and give it a similar yellow color. Continuing down here, we have the wheel or upper leg element. And although the illustration shows here that it is metal, I think it would actually be quite nice if it retained that green body shader with a metal element in the middle. So in order to do that with our object selected over in material options, let's create two material slots by hitting the plus here, 1 and 2. And for the top one, we want our base material. And for the next one down, we want to go with metallic. And in order to apply that metallic, we need to jump into edit mode and start selecting geometry. So I'm just going to hit Alt and A to make sure nothing is selected. Then over this central cylinder here, let's just hit L, and then we can move over to Assign and tab back out into object mode. I think that looks pretty cool. And we only have one more element to go, and that is the joining element here, which I think could also be metallic. So let's select the object here, create a new material slot like before, and introduce our metal again into edit mode with tab. If it is not already selected, hovering over and hitting L, and then clicking Assign. Okay, looking really, really good. Now, you no doubt noticed that when we were creating our materials, particularly on these small items here, we have this sort of strange ringed effect here, and this is because of our depth map. Our procedural material needs it, but because the item is so small, it doesn't have enough depth granularity to properly render the material. Thankfully, we can adjust that easily if we hit N on the viewport, and you could see under View here, we have Clip Start and End. And this defines where our depth map starts and ends also. So if we were to restrict that with 0.1 and turn the end down to 20, you can see our material ringed effect has cleared up nicely. Alright, I am very happy with the materials here, and so we no longer need to see our concept sketch, and we can close this window effectively by moving up to the top here and click and drag to join the areas like so. You can also do this by hovering over the border here, right click, and just clicking join left. So we are presented with the one 3D viewport. And before we start moving ahead with our rigging, we need to address some of the geometry here, as we're using mirror modifiers and we'll need to move these objects independently from one another, and also in most cases have quite a large collection of modifiers. Now what this can do is slow down our 3D performance, and when animating in the 3D viewport, we want as much of that as possible, as it can get very, very frustrating otherwise. But before we start applying any of these modifiers, we want to create effectively a backup of our Frogbot so we can always jump back and tweak things. And an easy way to do that, I'm just going to hit Z in the 3D viewport, move on over to wireframe, and then making sure we are on select box, click and drag our entire character. And then with our cursor again over the 3D viewport, we can hit M on the keyboard, create a new collection, and we'll call this one Frogbot Editable. And that moves everything nicely into one collection here. Now this is effectively our backup, so what we can do is duplicate this entire collection, right click, duplicate collection. We want to avoid the duplicate linked option, as this will only duplicate the reference to the mesh, so we will effectively have multiple objects with the same underlying mesh. So duplicate collection here, and I'm going to move over and rename this one Frogbot Rigged in a preemptive manner, because this is the one we will be rigging. Now we can uncheck the editable collection here, and now we can prepare the geometry for rigging without fear of losing any of the editability, because we have stored a duplicate in this collection here. So to apply modifiers, we can click an object, and on the toggle down here, we can just start hitting apply. Like so. Again, 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 and again, making sure to do it in the top to bottom order, the order of operations. Now, this is going to be quite time consuming for all of the objects, but thankfully there is a better way. We can select, say, another object, again with lots of modifiers, and hit Shift and G. Then we can select by group, and the group we want to select is the type of object, i.e. mesh object. So let's select that, and it selects pretty much everything bar our curve antenna here at the top. And now we have all of those mesh objects selected. We can right click and convert to mesh. And this effectively takes a visual snapshot of that mesh with all of the modifiers and collapses everything down to simple geometry. So as you can see now, when I am toggling through the objects, there are no modifiers, and so the overhead when rigging and playing back our animation will be very, very small. Right, now let's look at making sure we have separated objects where we need to. And in order to make this slightly easier, we can move up here to our viewport shading options, and under object color, we can change to random. And this just helps us see which objects are in effect one object with a mirror modifier applied. So in order to separate these out, we can jump into edit mode with tab on the keyboard, jump into wireframe, select one side, and hit P on the keyboard to separate by selection. Now we can hit tab to jump back out into object mode, and then Z to switch to our solid mode in order to see the result. And let's repeat that process for the other items. Selecting them, tab into edit mode, into the wireframe mode, box select, P, and selection. Back out into object mode and moving over to the pupil object. And again, edit mode, select one side, hit P, and selection. And down here, the foot, definitely into edit mode, box select, P, selection, tab back out. Now looking at the foot, we want to move the foot and the little hinge here at the back separately. So let's jump into edit mode. Hit A on the keyboard to select all, and then P, and by loose parts. Back out into object mode, and here we have two objects. Let's do the same this other side. So tab, A, P, and loose parts, and tab back out. Just going to switch back to solid mode here. We've been doing a lot of separating elements, but I think we can do some joining here, as these two mouth elements will be moving as one. So we can select this segment and then holding Shift, click the other segment and do Control and J, and this joins the meshes together. And we can continue along these same lines here by selecting the pupil and the main base of the eye. Control J, again the pupil, Shift select the base of the eye, and Control and J. Let's jump back to our shaded material view to see if we've broken anything. Nope, everything still looks good. We have one last step to avoid future confusion, and that is resetting the origins. Because as you can see, this eye has the origin nicely in the center, but this one does not because of our mirror modifier. And this is the same for any of the objects that use the mirror modifier. So to remedy this, we can jump into wireframe mode and orthographic mode with 5 on the keyboard, select all of the objects on one side, Shift select the objects on the other side, and then go up to Object, set Origin, Origin to Geometry. And now we can see those origin points all rest nicely within the middle of our objects. Now, technically speaking, we didn't need to do this because the rig would in effect create new origin points for us. However, if we did need to, say, rotate one of our objects, it could get confusing when the origin point is, say, miles away from where the object is. So that's why we have reset them. Okay, we have all of our mesh prepped and we're ready to start rigging. In order to start adding bones to our frogbot, we need to add an armature object. Firstly, I'm just going to select any of the objects here to make sure we are within our frogbot rigged collection. And we want to add our armature in the world center here. So the first bone sits on the floor nicely. So to snap our cursor to the world center, we can do Shift and S, cursor to world origin like so, and then Shift and A to add a new object, and this object is an armature. And this also creates our first bone, which as you can see, it's a little bit too large. But before we go in and start editing things, we're going to make a few visual adjustments to help us going forward. So if we move on over to our armature options here and start scrolling down until you find viewport display, we're going to check in front. So the bone is always in front, and we're going to display as stick, just a little bit less intrusive. Now with that stick selected, we can hit Tab to jump into edit mode and select it like so. And we want to scale it, but we want to scale it around the pivot location at the bottom here. And by default, if we just hit S, you can see it doesn't do that. But we can make it do that by changing our transform pivot point. And we're going to move it to active element. This aligns nicely to the root of our bone. So when we scale it now, you can see it's working as intended. And that is effectively our first bone. But before we do anything else, let's rename it. And to rename something very easily with it selected in the viewport, you can hit F2 and let's call it body. Now we're going to hit Tab to jump back out into object mode. And we want to place our next bone. And the next obvious thing we're going to need to animate are the wheel and foot element here. So thankfully we have had some foresight and corrected the pivot points. So they are smack in the middle here. And we can use that pivot point to place our bone. But first we need to snap our cursor to it. So Shift and S, cursor to selected. Then we can select our armature again, go into edit mode with Tab, and then Shift and A to add a new bone. And let's select that bone and scale it down again because it is way too big. And to create some visual distinction and to line up with the axis of the wheel here, I'm going to snap to the front view, which will automatically switch us to orthographic view. If it doesn't, you can check it here. And then we want to rotate our bone 90 degrees. So we can hit R to rotate and then just type in 90, like so. Now, this looks good, but it's sticking a little bit far out. So let's just hit G and X and move it in. It doesn't really matter that it was far out, but just for visual consistency. Now let's rename it with F2 and call it leg. Let's call it leg wheel because that is what it looks like. And we're going to add L to denote the left side of our frog. That's the frog's left, not camera left. This will help us later when mirroring our rig over. Okay, moving on, let's jump back out into object mode or tab on the keyboard and select our eye here. And again, we can do exactly what we did before. Snap our cursor to it with Shift and S, cursor to selected, select our armature, tab to go into edit mode. And this time we can use an existing bone here by duplicating it with Shift and D like so, and then hitting Shift and S to snap selection to cursor. This just saves us a little bit of time rotating the bone. Let's scale it down a little bit more. F2, and we'll call it eye, and then we'll stick an L here again because it is the left eye. This will help us a little bit later. Moving down to the foot element here, I think we want to hinge off the very back part. So back out into object mode. Let's select this little joining area here and / to go into local view. We're going to select a few points here to use the geometry to place our 3D cursor. So I'm going to select these two, one side, and these two, the other side, and then Shift and S, cursor to selected, and this puts the cursor right in the middle of all of those points selected. Now tab to go back out into object mode and / to remove the local view mode. We can select our armature, tab to go into edit mode, and hit Shift and A, and this creates the bone here. Now I'm going to middle click to orbit and hold down Alt so it snaps to the side. And we're going to do similar to what we did before, but in the opposite direction. So rotate minus 90 degrees, and then S to scale and bring it down to somewhere like that. Now F2 to rename, and we want to call this one foot, and again L as the little suffix here. Okay, there are only two more elements we need to animate. One is the antenna to have a nice little bit of secondary animation. So let's jump into object mode, select the top ball of our antenna here, Shift and S, cursor to selected, select our armature, go into edit mode, Shift and A to add a bone, and again we can scale this down quite a lot. In fact, we can use a numeric to make this a little bit faster. We can do S and do 0.01, and this just scales it down very, very quickly. So let's rename antenna. Just as a quick aside, if you have forgotten to add an L at the end of your bone name, you can always just multiple select and go up to armature, names, and auto name left and right, and it will do it for you. Okay, we have one more bone to manually place, and that is for our mouth here in order to be able to open it. As you can see, if we were to rotate it here along the X, it rotates along its pivot point, which isn't ideal. It doesn't give the right effect. It should, in effect, if we go into local view here with both of these objects selected, it should rotate around this semicircular shape here, which it currently doesn't do. So we need to place a bone in the middle of this shape as if it was a circle. Thankfully, we can refer back to some previous geometry to accomplish this, and that is the cutter we originally set up for our Boolean operation. So if we move back over to our outliner here, you can see we have our Boolean cutters collection. If we check that on, we can see selected here, we have the one that was used to cut out the mouth shape. At the moment, it is boundary boxed, but we can change that. I'm going to move this up a little bit by scrolling down and under viewport display, changing display from bounds to say wire here. And now we can extract the ideal center point. So if we jump into edit mode, we want to go into vertex selection. And we want the farmost left and the farmost right point here. And we want that the other side too. Like that. And then if we were to do Shift and S, cursor to selected, that is the exact center point we need to rotate our mouth around. We can hide our Boolean cutters now. We don't need to see those. And we can jump out of local view, select our armature, tab to go into edit mode, and then Shift and A to create a new bone. And then we can do scale 0.1, then F2 and rename this mouth. Okay, to finish up, we just need to duplicate the left bones here over to the right side. Thankfully, there's a very easy way to do that. We can jump into edit mode, select all three, go up to armature, and then go to symmetrize. And you can see here, if you look at the top left-hand corner, these are named the exact same, except the L has been changed to an R. This nice little shortcut is only possible because we spent the time adding the L suffix on our left-sided bones. Okay, time to start parenting the objects to the bones in order to influence their transforms. Let's start with the body bone first. We need to select every object that we want to follow the body bone. So for that, we want the antenna, the little antenna join as well, this segment, and the main body segment. Then we can shift select our armature. Hit tab to go into the edit mode of our armature. Select the bone we want to parent to, then hit tab to go back out into object mode. And not hitting anything else, hit Control and P. This gives us the option to parent not to the armature object, but to the bone within the armature. So let's select that option. And we can always test it by selecting our armature again, and this time going into pose mode. This is an option available up here. It's also available with Control and Tab. And you can see our body bone is still selected. And if we hit G, we can grab it and we are taking all of those objects with us. Let's right click to drop. So let's continue this trend by going back out into object mode. In some cases, you may need to jump back here because it will toggle between edit and pose. Or you can use the pie menu, which is Shift and Tab, and then move on over to object mode. Let's select the eye here, Shift select the armature, tab to go into edit mode, select our eye bone, tab to go back out into object mode, Control P, and bone. The leg wheel here, Shift select our armature, tab edit mode, select the bone we want, tab back out into object mode, Control P, bone. Now we want both our foot and our connected element here to be parented to our foot bone. Shift selecting the armature, tab to go into edit mode, select the bone, tab back out into object mode, Control P, and bone. Working our way around, let's go with the mouth here, Shift select the armature, tab in, select the bone, tab out, Control P, bone. Select our foot, Shift select the connected element, Shift select our armature, tab in, select the bone, tab out, Control P, and bone. You can see this will get faster over time. Select the leg wheel, Shift select the armature, tab in, select the bone, tab out, Control P, and bone. The eye, Shift select armature, tab in, select bone, tab out, Control P, and bone. One more. A little ball on top of the antenna here. Shift select the armature, tab in to edit mode, select the bone, back out into object mode, Control P, and bone. Right, let's give this a full test by selecting our armature, Control Tab into pose mode, and we can grab all of these separate bone elements here and see that they are all affecting the right objects. That looks good. So if we were to animate the frogbot now, let's say we grab the body bone here and hit G, we can see that when we move it, it doesn't take its associated objects with it. So we need to parent, in effect, one bone to another. And we can do that considerably easier and in one mode, and that mode is edit mode. So what we want to do is parent the majority of bones to the body bone here. So I'm going to select the body bone and then hit A on the keyboard, which selects all other bones, still with our body bone as the active element, and then Control P, and then we want to make parent, but we want to keep the offset. If we hit connected here, they all just snap to the top. That's not what we want. So Control P, keep offset. And you can see here that we have a nice visual representation of the relationship. However, we need to correct a few here because when we rotate our wheel, we want to take the foot with it. So that needs to be a child of our parent bone, the leg wheel here. So we select our foot, shift select our leg wheel, Control P, again keep offset, and you can see that relation line has updated. And the same the other side, shift left click, Control P, keep offset. Now if we were to go into pose mode with Control and Tab or up here, and select our body bone and hit G, you can see we are taking all of the associated items with us, and this, as you would imagine, becomes a lot easier to animate. However, we have one remaining task, and that is, if we snap to the side view here and grab our antenna element and hit G, we're not actually taking the curve with us. So in order to remedy that, we need to use a slightly different technique. So with our antenna bone selected, let's go back out into object mode and then shift select our antenna curve and hit tab to go into edit mode. And here you can see we have our Bezier handle here, and we need to drag and select all 3 points of our Bezier handle. This gives us the option to hit Control and H, and then we can hook those points up to either a new object, selected object, or in this case, a bone, which we already have selected, so it knows which one. So let's do that, and you can see that relationship line change slightly there. So jumping back out into object mode, let's select our armature. I'm going to hit Control and Tab to quickly shortcut into pose mode. We're grabbing the antenna ball and taking the curve shape with us as well. It is almost time to start animating, but before we dive in, it's worth checking the transforms of the bones we will be animating to see if there's any sort of small issues. So with our armature selected, we can do Control and Tab to jump into pose mode. And we know we're going to be rotating these bones along the X here. And you can see it ever so slightly intersects with the body. I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue given the speed that the legs are going to flip around. However, the eye, yeah, there's quite a large intersection here. Although when we do animate this, we're going to be moving the eye in to accommodate for that. So that feels like it's going to work. In order to reset these bones, by the way, we can just do Alt and R. If we jump to the eye here, I'm just going to hit R twice to go into an orbit rotation. And you can see that the eye and the bone aren't exactly lined up properly, and this gives our eyeball an offset effect when we rotate it. So let's look at fixing this quickly. I'm going to right click to drop that bone rotation, hit Control and Tab to go into object mode, select our eye, go to / for local view, and then Tab, edit mode, grabbing with middle click, holding down Alt to snap to the front here. And in fact, we can already see our issue. Our origin point is off center, the center of the original sphere being this line here. And this is almost certainly to do with the extra geometry here that was included in the calculation when we reset our origin point to geometry. So we need to manually shift our bone over to this center point so we can snap our cursor to the selection we just made by going up to edge here and Alt and left clicking this loop of edges, then Shift and S cursor to selected, jump out into object mode and out of local view with / Going to move in a bit closer here. And before we do anything to the bone, we're going to hit Alt and P on the eye geometry and clear the parent, because we don't want any of the adjustments we're going to do to the bone affect the eyeball. So now we can go into the armature, into edit mode with tab, select the bone, and then hit Shift and S, selection to cursor this time. Then tab back out into object mode, select our eye, select our armature, knowing the bone is already selected, Control P, and parent to bone like so. Now let's do a little test here. In pose mode, yeah, that is way better. So I'm just going to quickly do the same thing the other side. So selecting the eyeball, / local view, tab for edit mode. In edge select, select the central edge, Shift and S, snap to cursor, back out into object mode, out of local view, Alt P, clear the parent, select the armature, select the bone in edit mode, Shift and P, selection to cursor, back out into object mode, select the eye, select the armature, Control P and bone. There we go. We're all set. Now, the only other thing that I would quite like to change is the position of our root bone. I don't feel like it properly represents the center of gravity for our character. And also, when we rotate here, the front of our character is dipping below the ground line here. We can mitigate against both of these by shifting the bone over to the left here. And we're going to do the same process as before. Making sure we are in object mode, we're going to select all of the objects that are the child of our body bone. So that's the body section here, the segment here, the little segment here, and the antenna. Alt and P, clear the parent. Go in to our armature, going to snap to the side, go into edit mode, hit G and Y, and move our bone up to, let's say, somewhere here. Then Control and Tab and select object mode. Reselect those objects before, so the antenna, the little join, this segment and the full body. Shift select our armature, Control and P, and we have reparented the body to that now offset bone. So selecting the armature again and doing Control and Tab, we can rotate and we can see this feels a lot more center weighted. Okay, testing out the other little bits here and there, and I think we are good to go. So let's move on to animating this character. Before jumping into animation, there are a few things we need to note. We will be animating bones on location and rotation. The location is described with the XYZ axes. Rotation, however, can use one of two main methods. One is Euler, which is the default for objects, and the other is Quaternion, which is the default for bones. Euler is arguably more logical, rotating on the X, Y, and Z axes. However, it suffers from gimbal lock when two axes are aligned after rotation. We can force the rotation to, say, make this arrow point to the left, but as you can see, the XYZ values need to dance all over the place to achieve this, resulting in a very wobbly animation. Quaternion is a more complex calculation that has an extra W value. It does not suffer from gimbal lock, resulting in smooth animation that accurately transitions from one orientation to the other. So Quaternions are looking pretty good, right? Well, yes, they are fantastic for more organic animation, where you can rotate in multiple axes without fear of coming across the gimbal lock issue. However, for our Frogbot, we're going to be using Euler rotations for the following reason. Let's say we want to spin this arrow. With Euler rotation, it's as simple as grabbing the axis we want and continuing to increase the values on a new keyframe, and the result is a spinning arrow as expected. Let's try the same with Quaternion. The result is a smooth transition, again from the start orientation to the end orientation with no spinning at all. As we're mainly animating in one axis of rotation for our Frogbot and need to spin the legs, we'll be setting them all to Euler. So let's do that now. Okay, let's look at adjusting the bone rotation method for all of our bones. Firstly, we can select our armature and go up to object mode and change it to pose mode, and then hit A on the keyboard to select all of the bones within. And over to the side panel here, if you don't see it, you may need to hit N on the keyboard. And we want to change the quaternion to XYZ Euler. But before we just left click it, we need to hold Alt. This tells Blender to affect all of the bones. So Alt, left click, XYZ Euler. And now they all have that new rotation method. While we are at it, if we move over to our output options, we can change our end frame to 60 and our frame rate to 30, giving us 2 seconds of animation suited for online viewing. And lastly, if we move over to our timeline options, we can check auto key. This ensures that when we do move a bone, it automatically adds a key to our timeline. So let's start doing just that. Okay, we are still in pose mode and I have the body bone selected here. And in order to commit our first keyframe without adjusting the pose at all, we can, with our cursor over the 3D viewport, just hit I on the keyboard. This, as you can see, commits a key to all of the channels here, and this is denoted by the yellow color. Now we want to hold for a beat before we do the jump, so over at frame 5, let's just hit I over the keyboard again, and Blender shows us that there has been no changes between these two keyframes by drawing an orange bar. Now let's move over to, say, frame 13, hit G and Y and move our frogbot forward. Just going to reposition slightly. And we have our first jump. But as you can see, we hover over 13 here. We only have a keyframe on the Z axis. I know it looks like the Y, that's the global axis, but the Z is the local axis of our bone here. If in doubt, we can always move over to the armature options and just check axes. And you can see, yes, this is indeed our Z axis. Now I'm happy with the position, but I also want a keyframe on all of the rotation values here too. So again, we can just hit I over the keyboard. Moving on, let's say we hold that position until frame 42. Let's hit I on the keyboard again to commit a key, and then jump backwards to frame, let's say 54. Now we don't actually have to move the bone, we can instead hit Alt and G, which moves back to our default pose or rest pose. And let's play that animation through. It's more sliding than jumping, so let's add a little bit of height between these two keyframes. So G and Z, increase the height slightly. Let's move to a slightly better vantage point so we can see that. Excellent. And between these two keyframes, let's do the same. The jump is happening a little bit slow for my liking here, so we can select all of the keys and just hit S and scale. Okay, we have our body animation done, but we want to motivate it with the spinning of our legs here. So we can select both of our leg bones by shift and left clicking. And then as we know, the animation starts at frame 5. We can hit I over the 3D viewport to commit our first set of keyframes. And then we land at frame 13. Now we can rotate along the global X, and I'm just going to hold Control, and this will automatically snap to 5-degree increments, which we can see along the top of the 3D viewport, and until we get all the way over to 360. And then we can left click again, and this will automatically set a keyframe. So let's see what we have. Yeah, that's the kind of motion we want. And we want to reverse that for our jump backwards. So we start here at 42, I on the keyboard to commit a keyframe, and then we complete the jump at frame 52. And we can, again, like we did with the body bone, hold down Alt and tap R to reset the rotation so it effectively flips back the other way. The next thing it would be good to address for our primary pass would be the eye animation. As our legs flip around, you can see that it quite obviously will intersect with the eye. So we can animate the eyes shifting into the body for that period of time. So I'm going to shift back to frame 8, where we can set our first keyframe if we select both of the eye bones here and hit I on the keyboard over the 3D viewport. And then when the eyes are pretty much intersecting here, we can grab the bone and move it in. But if we were to do it with both bones selected, You can see the result we have. It makes total sense as we are moving both bones to the left. However, we can also enable this expose option up here. And now if we were to do the same, hit G and X, we have a mirrored pose. And this is exactly what we want. After the foot has fully passed, let's go to frame, let's say 13. And we can hit Alt and G to bring those eyes back, and we have our animation. I may adjust it ever so slightly so it becomes a bit more obvious by grabbing the first frame and hitting G and moving it back to frame 7, and the end frame and moving that back out to frame 14. That feels a little bit more visible. And of course, we need to do the same on the reverse here, but instead of grabbing the eyes and moving them, we can just copy the keyframes we already created. So selecting all three here, hitting Shift and D, and moving them across to here, starting at frame 43. Then when we're at frame 46, we're completely clear of the foot, and the eyes come back out. For the final part of our primary animation, we're going to open the mouth after the frog jumps forward. So selecting our mouth bone here at the front and choosing a frame after the first jump. Let's go to frame 20 here. We can hit I on the keyboard, and I think the mouth would open quite quickly. So let's give it 4 frames and rotate along the X like so. And then we can copy frame 24 by selecting it, Shift and D, to move it over to frame 34, and then copy our start frame at frame 20 over to frame 38. So jump, frog sound, and jump back. So with our primary pass done, we can move on to our secondary pass of animation, and here we will create the feeling of weight and inertia. Right, let's dial in some of that secondary animation, and we're going to start with our body bone here, which has a fairly simple animation on, and in order to see that animation better, we can switch our timeline over to Graph Editor. I'm just going to click here and bring it up so we have a little bit more room to play with, and then click over here and switch to Graph Editor. There is also a handy shortcut. If you are over the Graph or Timeline Editor, you can hit Control and Tab, and this toggles between them. So back in the Graph Editor, and as long as you have this option checked, it will only show the curves of the selected object, i.e. our body bone, which is exactly what we want. If you don't want to see this panel, we're not going to be using it, you can hit N, and if you would like to auto-fit our curves into the space we have available, we can check Normalize. This makes the animation very clear. We have our green curve here, which is the Y-axis. I'm just going to move over to the armature options and check on axis so we can see that, the Y. And we have our blue location, which is our Z-axis. If we were to select our Y-axis, just by click, drag, selecting, you can see that this is mirrored over in the channels column here. And to make our life even easier, we can do Shift and H, and this will hide everything but our selected channel. Now we want to create a bounce. So effectively our frogbot goes up along the Y, hits the ground, and ricochets back up. So let's create a hold frame here. Selecting that end frame, Shift and D, then X to restrict it to that X axis. Let's drop it here. I know it looks a bit confusing, but it's good to remember that the filled dot here is our actual keyframe. The little unfilled dots either side are our Bezier handles. This is more viewable if we were to rotate them like so. So we have our key duplicated. We want to do one more duplication, Shift and D, and move it up. This is in effect our bounce, but we don't want to ease out as we hit the floor because nothing is slowing us down. So we can select this keyframe, hit Scale, and we can either do this by hand or just type 0. And this removes any easing for that key. And we want the same for this key as well, S and 0. And you can see as well the Bezier handles have completely overlapped to our key here. Maybe we can have one more little bounce. So let's select those 2 keyframes, Shift and D, X, bring it out a little bit, I'm going to reduce the time in which this second bounce takes to happen. So let's do it something like that and hit G and Y this time to restrict it to the Y. And that second bounce can be very small. Let's see what we have. Excellent, that feels really nice. I find it also handy to improve the arcs here. So let's just say, because there looks like there's a bit of easing, we're going to scale this up so it's a proper arc. And the same here. Let's just see what that looks like. Really nice. So we can copy what we have done here with the bounce effect over to the other side as our Frogbot returns. With Shift and D, again tapping X to restrict to that axis, and move it over until our front frame, that's hard to say, overlaps the end frame. Like that. Let's have a look. Excellent. Right, we're making some good progress, and the next channel we're going to affect is the X rotation. As we are moving sharply on the Z-axis, it feels like the weight, particularly the top-weighted nature of our Frogbot, would be left behind ever so slightly, kind of like this. So we can find our channel here, X Euler rotation, and make that visible. I'm also going to hide the Y location here, as we don't need to see that anymore. And with our X Euler rotation selected, we can go to where the Frogbot starts to move. And to ensure there's a key on there, over our graph editor, we can hit I and insert keyframes only on selected channel. Now we can move a few across, and we want to rotate backwards slightly. So we can do it in the viewport here. Rotate X backwards like so. And we can see our first keyframe here. And we want to find where we land, which is frame 13. I already have a keyframe, but if you don't, you can hit I insert. Just going to move back here so we have a bit more space. And now what we want to do is overshoot, as we aren't restricted by a brick wall or anything like that. So we can hit G and overshoot the motion like so, and then Shift D, undershoot. And I'm just going to select the Alt keyframe here and hit Shift and D to duplicate and bring it forward. And we have some under and overshoot working here like so, which feels nice. Maybe we could have a slight little bit of overshoot at the end. That feels good to me. And when the Frogbot jumps back, it will be leaning forward, leaving some of its top heavy weight behind. So we can do that here or in the graph editor by Shift D and moving our keyframe like so. Goes to land, hits the ground. So we know that point is hitting the ground. Let's overshoot and undershoot. And we want to have our in keyframe always be here at the end because we are looping. Something like that looks good. Let's just see. Maybe we can adjust keys ever so slightly. I think that looks good. Okay, with our body bone done, let's move on to tweaking some other elements. If we move our Frogbot to the side here with the middle click to orbit and holding Alt to snap to the X axis, we can see that as the Frogbot jumps, there's a lot of intersecting with the ground that happens with the foot. Now we can remedy that by tweaking our leg wheel bones. But before we do that, let's just make sure we uncheck, if you happen to have it on, the X pose option, as this can mess about with some of the rotation. So let's shift select the other bone here. Again, snap to that X view. And all we're going to do is adjust the animation so the foot never goes through the floor. So here we can just rotate back ever so slightly. And a little rotation here. Bit more rotating back. Here we can rotate like so. Then it lands. We don't want it to clip through. Let's do an adjustment here. And we're going to start rotating back down again. We have that slight wobble. Let's compensate for that a little bit. There we go. Let's have a look and see what that looks like. Much better, and we don't have that intersecting with the ground. and it feels pretty natural. So let's do the same the other side here, just in case we have any intersection. Yeah, we definitely do. So let's rotate here ever so slightly, and here we can already correct. Just move in for a closer look here to see what we're working with, making sure there's not too much of an unnatural curve. Here, I think we can land the foot on the ground. And then I'm just going to reset the rotation with Alt and R. Let's see what that feels like. Yeah, that feels pretty good to me. Right, onto the antenna to give it that last little bit of secondary animation. And I think for this one, because we can do it mostly visually, we're going to compress down our panel here and switch back to our timeline, either by switching here or again doing Control and Tab. Now, selecting our armature, Control and Tab to go into pose mode, we're going to select our antenna bone here and snap to the side. And firstly, we know that our movement doesn't start until frame 5, so let's commit a key to that with I on the keyboard over the 3D viewport. And I think because we are moving forward very quickly, we can rotate and just drag our antenna back. So it starts dragging back like so, and we hit the ground around about 13. So let's add a keyframe here. This is a hold. And then that antenna is going to want to continue going forward. So let's give it to frame 16 and move it forwards like so. You might want to affect the arc a little bit here, so just drag it up a bit. And then we are going to basically over and undershoot until we resolve back to our original position. So forward, want to go back a bit, like so. And then we can hit Alt R and Alt G to reset, and that kind of motion looks pretty good to me. You might want to under and overshoot ever so slightly more. That feels good. And on the return, we start moving at frame 42. So let's commit a key with I. And we're moving backwards at speed here. So let's hit G and move our antenna back. Just going to rotate it so we have that nice curve still. And again, when we hit the ground, we want to continue that motion. So let's add a key as soon as we hit the ground. I, and then continue that motion going back like so. And then we haven't got long here, so let's just reset the rotation and position with Alt R, Alt G, and we have that secondary animation. We might want to speed that up a bit, just so we can squeeze in one more under and overshoot. Moving our end frame back a little bit and tweaking until we're happy. And let's see what that looks like without all of the overlays by hitting Shift, Alt and Z. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Just a quick note, as I've noticed that the back of the Frogbot intersects with the floor on the return jump here. So in order to fix that quickly, we can expand, Control and Tab to switch over to our graph editor, and just adjust when the rotation happens. So I'm going to move this rotation key back ever so slightly. We can scale that handle down and move this forward ever so slightly and scale those handles up for a nicer result where the body doesn't intersect anywhere near as much. We might need to do a little bit of adjustment now for our leg. Which actually makes the curve slightly better. Yeah, just a quick fix in case you came across the same thing. Okay, we have our snazzy animation, but our Frogbot exists in an empty void of crushing uncertainty. So let's fix that. Okay, let's frame our camera, but to start with, we need a camera, and by default, Blender does include a camera and a light in the scene, but I don't want to assume that your scene has this. So what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is shift select both and hit X and delete. Then moving in here, we're going to uncheck the auto key because we don't want to be automatically creating keys from here on out. And in case you don't know where your 3D cursor is, we can do Shift and S, cursor to world origin to bring it back into the center. Now, up in our outliner here, we're going to either create a collection with C or use one that already exists. I have one up here. Double click and we're going to name this camera and light. Now over our 3D viewport, we can Shift and A and introduce a camera. This is just dropped into the center of the world here where our 3D cursor is and at the orientation we happen to be looking at, but not obviously at the right position. But a quick way to remedy that is to line our view up roughly where we want our camera to be looking. And then with our camera still selected, we can go up to View, Align Active Camera to View. And this snaps our camera to the 3D view. If we want to tweak things further, we can move over here to lock our camera to the view. And any adjustments we were to make, orbiting with middle click and zooming in and out, will cause the camera to update as well. As you can see here, we are still within the bounds of our camera. Then we can uncheck that and we are free to move around again. Let's just test our framing here. Now we're moving out of frame a little bit, and also I want to make a few further adjustments. So moving over to our camera options, I want a slightly more zoomed in focal length. So as you can see here, we're zooming in. I want something like 85. This just flattens out the perspective a little bit. And for resolution, I want a square format, so I'm going to move to the output options. And for resolution X and Y, we can click and actually drag down to select both fields and release and type in the value we want. I'm going to keep it quite low, so 1024. Let's zoom out again and we can start scrubbing the timeline to see if the framing works. Now the robot is still going out of frame here, so let's lock our camera to view again. Just zoom out, make a few adjustments. Yeah, that feels nicer. Cool, let's go with something like that for the moment. I'm going to unlock again so we can feel free to move around without fear of our camera moving too. Okay, let's create a backdrop here, and with our 3D cursor in the center still, we can do Shift and A and add a mesh plane. Now we can scale it down a little bit. Maybe it doesn't need to be so large. And again, any scaling we do in object mode needs to have its scale applied. Then we can create a back wall by jumping into edit mode with tab and going into edge select mode up here, selecting the back edge, hitting E for extrude and then Z to restrict to the Z axis. Now we're going to create a nice curve here. But in order to do so, we're going to use a bevel modifier. Hit tab to go back out into object mode. Move over to our modifiers. Add modifier. Search for our good friend, the bevel modifier. And then we can increase the amount of curve here. And then crank up the segments. I might go as high as 32. Then we can right click, shade smooth, and under shading, click harden normals. Now in order to have a constant view from our camera here, I'm going to go up to the top right of our 3D viewport, click, drag out to create a split screen, and one of the views can be looking through the camera here, which you can instigate by going up to View, Cameras, Active Camera. Or if you have a number pad, it is 0 on the number pad, or simply by clicking this icon here. Let's just readjust these windows here like so. And we want to select our background and we want to rotate it on the Z-axis so it roughly lines up with our camera here. In our camera view area here, let's just enable our material view. Select our background. Go to materials and create a new material. Let's just call it background. And I'm going to go for a sort of a yellow color here and increasing the roughness a little bit. Yeah, I think that looks good. It's more than likely that you have the Robotic Planet Assets library already set up and ready to go based on the materials portion of this course. However, if you do not have that, just a quick reminder, you can download it from cgboost.com/frogbot, drop it into a folder, and then go up to Edit, Preferences, and then under File Paths, you can see Asset Libraries. Here you can hit the plus button here, locate the folder where you have installed your blend file, and just click Add Asset Library, making sure to change the import method to Append. Now we can drag up a new window, like so, and switch this editor over to Asset Browser, where if we toggle options here, we can see Robotic Planet Assets. And here we have some subcategories, namely materials and what we want, meshes. Now we can drag out the plants here. I'm just going to put them there and just realign them slightly with G and Shift and Z to lock the global Z. And I think we can change the color over in the materials options to the same kind of yellow we have the background. And we're done with our asset library here. So we can click right at the bottom right and collapse it like so. Now it's just a case of positioning our assets in a pleasing way. So I'm just going to snap to the top on this 3D viewport. And over on this 3D viewport, I'm going to hide all of the graphic overlays and hit T to hide our tool panel and start arranging. I'm going to hit G here and scale up 1. G, move this one back, maybe make it slightly larger. And I think one could be slightly smaller here. We can also hit Alt and D to duplicate the mesh while keeping the object data. And I'm just going to scale. And I'm also going to scale non-uniformly on the Z axis, like so. So that's S and Z, and then R and Z to rotate. Now you can tweak this to your liking, duplicating with Alt and D whenever you feel you want more grass. Right, I'm going to time-lapse through the rest of this as all of the operations are much the same and it's mainly about small adjustments here and there. Cool, I'm happy with my layout now and hopefully you are too. We can always come back to it, but until then let's move on to some lighting. For this section we will be adding lights into our scene, starting out with an ambient light via an HDRI, then a key light, the main front-on light for our frogbot, then a backlight to give our character a little bit more separation from the background, as well as a small highlight for the eye, and lastly a light specifically for our backdrop that draws the eye into the center of frame. So far we have been using a default environment shader to light our scene here, which you can see in the material view by toggling down here, and this is our HDRI. However, if we were to switch over to the rendered view here, you can see everything goes a little bit dark. This is because we haven't set up a world shader, which we can get from the Robotic Planet Asset Library. So if we move on up to our window here and switch editors over to Asset Browser, then under Robotic Planet Materials, we have one called Robot World. And this is the shader that has been used on pretty much all of the Robotic Planet scenes. And we can click, drag it to our scene and release. Now, if we change our editor over again to Shader Editor and change from Object to World, we can see the shader setup. We can also see that we can rotate the shader round. As the texture is effectively a globe, we only want to rotate it on the Z axis, as anything else would cause things like horizons to shift off axis. So I'm just going to tweak it around a little bit, and what we're looking for is just a very gentle, uniform ambient light. We will be adding additional lights on top. Yeah, this feels nice, but I feel it is contributing slightly too much light to the scene, so let's just move over here, and under the background strength, we can turn this down to 1. Okay, let's add our first light into the scene. To add our first light, let's switch our shader editor back to our 3D viewport. Here we can better see where we are placing our light. So Shift and A light, and we want a spotlight. We zoom out a little bit, we can see that it was spawned right here in the world center pointing down. So let's hit G and move it up and rotate it to point at our frogbot. Just going to go to the top view here and have it slightly to the left of camera and just keep rotating it to make sure our frogbot is in that hot spot, acknowledging the fact that it will be jumping back and forth. Now, if we move on over to our light options here, we can increase the power significantly. Let's try a 150. Let's turn it down a little bit more. Let's stay around 50. And we're producing very hard shadows that you can see here. So to soften those out, we need to increase the radius of the source here. So we can start turning this up and you can see that nice soft shadow coming in. I think we can go pretty big. Let's go with 0.45. Now we still have a very obvious spotlight here. You can see this almost perfect circle. And we can adjust that, make it a little bit more softer with the blend. And we can adjust the angle slightly as well to make that circle a bit bigger, like so. I'm just going to hit G and move it over a little bit more so the light always hits our frogbot. Okay, that's our first light, and that is our key light. So let's name it as such by hitting F2 on the keyboard over the 3D viewport and type key light. And while we are at it, let's just arrange our outliner ever so slightly. We want our camera and light in our camera and light collection, and we don't want our plants in there, and we don't want our background in there, which is this plane. So I'm going to just double click in the outliner and rename it as background and move that out into the scene collection like so. Then we can select our camera and lights again and move on to the next light. Right, moving on to our second light, and we can use this light as a backlight, or sometimes known as a rim light. And this will help separate our character from the background more, as you can see it's sort of merging together here, as well as adding a nice highlight to the eye. So let's introduce the light, and this time we're going to use an area light, as we don't really need to restrict the spread. So over in the 3D viewport, Shift and A, light, area. Then we can hit G and move it up here. And we want it behind our frogbot. So I'm going to scale it down, rotate it into place. And you can see the effect it's having already. It's separating out our character from the background very nicely. A little bit more height here. Yeah, that looks nice. We're getting some nice catch light here on the bevels as well as in the eye. The only thing I don't like is the square shape. I feel like a nice circular highlight would be good. Thankfully, we can change this in the lighting options. Shape here from square to disc. Okay, let's see if that continues to work throughout our animation. I might adjust things ever so slightly. I'm just hitting R twice on the keyboard here to go into orbit mode. That feels nice, so let's rename our light here to backlight and move on to the next one. We have one more light to go, and this will be exclusively for our background. So let's introduce another spotlight here with Shift and A, light, spotlight, and we want to rotate it and move it up so we are pointing at the background. Just moving here like so. Then we can move over to our light options, increase the blend, increase the power, and I don't like these harsh shadows here, so we can move over to the radius and just start dialing that up until we have nice soft shadows. So with our light still selected, let's over the 3D viewport hit F2 to rename it to backdrop light. And this just uses our light to nicely frame the character within the scene. Now we have all our lights in place, I am going to move a few of the plants around just to make the scene feel a little bit nicer. And before we jump into the next section where we will be adding compositing effects, let's just increase our render quality by moving over to the render options here. And we're going to start dialing up our samples until a lot of the noise that we see in the shadows, for example, starts to disappear. I think 128 looks pretty smooth. So let's dial in that setting to our render samples as well. And while we are here in the option, we're going to activate jittered shadows. Now the eagle eye among you may have realized that this hasn't changed, well, anything really. However, if we were to select all of our lights here, I'm just going through and shift left clicking, and under the light options, under shadow, toggle that down. Holding Alt, we can click jitter, and you can see there a lot of our shadows have smoothed out, particularly over here in the corner, before and after. Now the only light that hasn't received jittered shadows is our area light here, and this is because it is of a different type to our two spots. So let's select that one and just make sure we have jittered shadows too. Cool, with our lighting all set up, we can look at adding that extra little something with some post-processing in the Compositor. Before we jump into the Compositor to add some effects, I think a really cool effect would be some slight shallow depth of field with our camera. Shallow depth of field is when elements blur depending on their depth outside of a focal plane or focus point. Accentuated with larger camera sensors or film backs and a larger lens aperture or opening with a long focal length, being more zoomed in. It is used a lot in photography and cinematography to isolate subjects. And in order to turn that on, we can select our camera, go to our camera options, and check depth of field. Now this is all out of focus, so we need to assign something to focus on. So let's toggle down the options here. And if we zoom our 3D viewport in for a closer look, we can click the eyedropper, the focus on object, and I'm going to use the right eye here as our focal point. And as you can see, that pops into focus. And if we want slightly more defocus, we can reduce our f-stop value. I'm going to go down to f2, and this contributes to isolating our character. Built into Blender is a very handy compositor, accessible up here in the window, switching on over to Compositor. Now we don't see anything in the compositing window to start with until we create a new node tree up here. Now we can see that we have our rendered layers outputting an image to our node group and viewer, and anything we put in between on this noodle here will affect the pixels of our image, much like how you would, say, add an effect in Photoshop. However, instead of diving through menu items, we are adding layer nodes again, similar to the 3D viewport with Shift and A, and then selecting the node we want. However, Blender also has this handy shelf of preset effects, which we can take advantage of now. Firstly, to give it more of an analog look, I'm going to add some lens chromatic aberration, which we can just drag on over the window like so. Then click and dragging it in between like so. Now you don't really see anything happening here, not until we move on all the way over to the right here and just toggle down our viewport shading options and switch our compositor on for our camera. So just under the compositor option here, we click camera. Now we can see the effect, and for me, the effect is pretty strong. So let's turn it down. I think something like 0.1 is strong enough. Continuing on our analog feel, let's introduce some sensor noise, and we can drag that after our chromatic aberration. Again, it's quite strong. Let's turn it way, way, way down. Values like that look good, and because we have an animated scene and we don't want static noise, we're going to check animated. Another lensing artifact I like to use is the vignette here. So let's drag that out, add it after our sensor noise, and this is very strong, but also what is quite distracting is all of our scene outside of our camera's view. This is easily adjusted by going over to our camera options, moving down to viewport display, toggling that open, and changing our passepartout number from 0.5 all the way up to 1. This just removes those visual elements outside of our camera. And we can continue to tweak our vignette by cranking up the feather, and I'm just going to turn down the factor ever so slightly. After adding some noise and chromatic aberration, I think we could sharpen our image slightly with an unsharp mask. So let's drag that on and introduce it after our vignette. Here's a quick view of what the unsharp mask does in isolation. So we're going to drop it onto our image here, which is a dark gray and a light gray side by side. And as you can see, it is adding local contrast along the edge only. The radius being how wide that contrast expands out, and the factor effectively being an opacity slider. And our threshold acts as a contrast cutoff. So if the difference isn't large enough between the two, it won't include it in the unsharp mask. This is very strong, so let's turn down the values here. I'm going to go with a 3 for radius, and the factor we can turn way down, maybe to something like 0.08. And finally, to affect the color and contrast slightly, we're going to introduce an RGB curves node, accessible with the Shift-A menu, color, adjust, RGB curves. Let's drop that on the end here. And this is a curves adjustment very similar to what you would do in Photoshop or any image editing program. We have our RGB channels for red, green, and blue, and the C here just has a combination of all of them. So if we were to add a slight S curve down here at the shadows, bringing that down to make it darker, and then bringing another node up to increase the brightness of our highlights. I'm going to drag the end node over here, just so we can increase those highlights a little bit more. Moving over to the red channel, maybe introduce a little bit of red into the midtones, and then the blue channel, we can reduce the blue on the highlights up here and introduce a little bit of blue in the shadows, creating a almost vintage vibe. And if at any point you want to switch a node on and off, you can, with it selected, hit M before and after. This is a little bit strong for me, so we can turn down the effect of our RGB curves with the factor slider here to something like 0.6. Now if we hit M for mute before and after, yeah, that feels a little bit nicer to me. And now we are ready to render our animation, so we can move on over to our output options here. Change our media type from image to video, toggle down our encoding, change it to MP4, and we can increase our output quality to high. These are just generic settings that will work well online. Now we can choose our output directory here and give our video the name frog_bot_version1 and then an underscore at the end because Blender likes to add a frame range at the end. Click accept, and then move on up to render and render animation. And now we wait. And there we have it, an awesome little robot frog built from the ground up in Blender, ready to share online. Congratulations, course complete. You have worked through an entire short animation production, and I'm keen to see your results. If you do share online, then don't forget to mention us at our various social media handles. I really hope you enjoyed your 3D robotic journey, and if you feel like you are just getting started, then perhaps I could tempt you over to join me and create the rest of the robotic family. There's BasicBot, a hovering camera with bouncy Wi-Fi antennas, FishBot, a jet-propelled claw with the memory of a goldfish, Owlbot, an advanced but boxy bird of prey, Snailbot, a pimped-out portable boombox, and OstrichBot, a hydraulic, high-speed running machine. Each subsequent bot has its own unique mechanic and increases the challenge. If you do want more information, then you can check out the full course overview, linked down in the description. So thank you so much for building your FrogBot with me, and I hope to see you over at Robotic Planet.